All right, my friends, we are talking about David Hume. And now that we've lost 10 minutes of the class, I need to talk about 1.3 times as fast as I usually would. I've given you the first few talking points, ideas and impressions. Customary relationship and induction. I'm giving these to you not in any particular order because in Hume it's kind of random anyway. I've been talking about a little bit of the characteristic of Hume's thought. It's not always consistent with itself. But the next item I'd like to mention to you is his view of the self. His view of the self. In a sense, what he's done is he's turned his guns, first of all, on the external world, doubting that what we think is out there as an objective order really is, because all we have are impressions. He then turns his guns on the inner world and doubts, in a sense, that the notion we have of a self is actually anything real. So it takes us to some strange places, but it would, it'd be asking this question. Ask yourself this question. Are you the same person today that you were, let's say, 5 years ago? Are you the same person today that you were 5 years ago? You think about yourself 5 years ago, and what does that make you? Now you're 18, so that would make you, what, 13? Is that right? Something like that. We have a sense, I can think back 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago. I can think clear back to being a kid. But I have to say, if the kid version of me walked in right now, you would see very little similarity, I think,
Hey, come on, Coley. We have one more. Who else has been here all the time? Okay, she told me to grab her.
Hey, I have perfect attendance. That should be.
You do?
No. But I had that award like 4 years in a row, and then we stopped giving it, so I stopped coming.
There's a dripping faucet in this here, and you're yakking about it. I missed that. I'm sorry. Where do you go?
Man, you're losing 20 minutes of your class. You should just give up now. Goratory's all
No, I got to keep going. It's a kind of an obsession. So anyway, Hume's conclusion is, number one, the self is not demonstrable. You cannot put it in a test tube. You can't measure, weigh, analyze, otherwise subject to any sort of scientific inquiry. The nature of the self, it's a kind of a fiction, it's an imaginative thing. And he postulates that it is but the ongoing experiences, perceptions, feelings of a central void. And that's the idea. In the middle of what you are is a void. And what you think is the self is just all of this collage of perceptions, feelings, experiences. And it creates some feeling, some sense that there's actually a self in there experiencing all this. Yes?
Totally off topic.
Mm-hmm.
Are the ladies supposed to exit first? Because
For fire?
Yes.
children first.
Yes, I think unless your body is actually on fire, ladies should, exit first. Yeah.
Well, they shouldn't go as slowly as what they're doing.
That's right, and ladies should not go slowly. All right. So you get the idea. I got your attention back? Okay. So the self, he doubts. Now this becomes much more important than maybe you're thinking, because this becomes one of the most important preoccupations of later philosophy is how do we understand the self? It's one of the biggest concerns of what's called existential philosophy, is how do we understand the self? Existentialism is passionately interested in the self, And in some ways, you'd say Hume was the reason that was raised as an issue. Now, along with the self, then two other items become questionable, and those are God and things. I can apply the same analysis that I do to the self to the notion of God. I don't experience God, I don't see God, I kind of imagine there's a God, but really all I have in my world of experience is just impressions, and really God is something that I've simply invented, arguably, to interpret my impressions. I mean, I suppose he would say if you believe in God, that's fine. But it's sort of like believing in causation. You don't really have any good reason to be confident of it. It's just a hypothesis, Yes?
How could he make that kind of a claim during his time period when the church was so prominent?
Well, he did it with some degree of caution. And some of his more robust criticisms of the notion of God weren't actually published till after he was dead. He was aware of that, and he was concerned about it, so he did sort of play it cozy during his life. He also raises the same question with respect to things. Things is simply referring to the whole external world, you see. You are aware of yourself as a subjective set of experiences. We've talked about this before. This is called the subject-object problem. You have a subjective sense of who you are. You think you're here, you think you're a self, and you have an idea, presumably, that there's something outside of you, not equal to you, which you are in fact experiencing right now. I'm looking at Sydney. I'm not confusing myself with her. I know that she is outside of me, objective, but I'm still having some sense that she's there. Something out there is apparently triggering something in here, and so the object and the subject are somehow related, but I cannot know for sure, says Hume, that object is really there. Maybe all there are just those impressions. So, assuming that Sydney is kind of a thing, for this purpose, I'm not so sure she's there. I'm not so sure God is there. I'm not even sure I'm here. Maybe this whole thing is just a set of kind of like fizz in water. Just a kind of a rapid set of fiery sensations that passes. How do I know that I even existed 5 minutes ago? Maybe I just kind of popped into being with an impression of a bunch of memories, and 5 minutes from now I'm going to be gone, says Hume. You have to say, you can't go very many places with Hume's philosophy. That was the biggest criticism of him. He sort of leaves us in this place of, well, then why bother? That's kind of the feeling. But anyway, those are the questions he raises, and that's where his really ferocious arguments against the existence of God come into this point, just showing that all of the things, like Trevor made this point when he was presenting on Hume, that all of the supposed arguments for the existence of God depend on ideas, principles, which are themselves not demonstrable. And the argument is only as good as its principles upon which it's based. And if those principles are no good, then the conclusions aren't very reliable. So he leaves us in this quandary of really radical skepticism. Yeah.
Just for back to my notes, is God and things, is that one of Hume's major points that he talks about?
Yeah.
So they're not, God and things and self are not connected.
These three are united together later. Hume deals with them separately. He deals with self, and then sort of separately God, who is external, and things, which are external. When we get to Kant, okay, everybody wake up. When we get to Kant, who, all things being equal, Sarah may be talking to us about Kant tomorrow, but who knows? We're going to find out that Kant distinguishes between what he calls the noumenal and the phenomenal. And at the noumenal level, this upstairs transcendent level, Kant puts three things. What do you suppose he puts up there? At the noumenal level, non-demonstrable ideas, which we have to, in a sense, assume are true. And what goes upstairs? What would you guess? Based on our present conversation, Matthew, you would assume that the noumenal level is populated by what three things? God, self, and things. What he calls the Dekon Sieg, which is about the only German I can speak, which means things or the thing in itself, or the essences of things. So Kant really gets his inspiration from Hume. Hume, who attacks these ideas vigorously, shows that they are non-demonstrable. Kant comes along and agrees. That's why it's noumenal. You can't get there from here. You can't prove, you can't demonstrate, you can't access by reason that level. But Kant adds what Hume wasn't so clear on: you've got to assume it. This is the birth of true, deep, presuppositional apologetics. You get it in Kant. You've got to assume it. You see, you can't prove it. So that's his answer to Hume. Now, Hume actually said something like that himself, but Kant builds a whole philosophy around the notion that though these things cannot be demonstrated, God, self, thing in itself, you've still got to proceed on the assumption that they are there. Okay. All right, so far so good. There's talking points in Hume. Next one, reason. Trevor, when he made his presentation, I thought treated this well, but it's something that can kind of get past you if you don't hear the force of it. We think reason is the vehicle by which we reach true, valid, reliable conclusions about the nature of things. I like to think of myself as a reasonable person. I say, why don't I eat tinfoil for lunch? Okay, there's a possibility. And then I apply my rational faculties to that question. And I think to myself, well, there's a variety of logical, sort of rational evaluation that I can use to think about eating tinfoil and reach a conclusion that it's not a reasonable thing to do. And I think that reason has led me to these conclusions. Hume says, not on your life. Hume says that's not the way reason works. And if you just go out and take a look at how reason actually is used in the world, you'll see that rarely, if ever, do you find that kind of thing going on. And he says this, so you might want to take this down and then reflect on it. Reason is not the method by which the mind reaches conclusions. Reason is not the method by which by which the mind reaches conclusions, comma, but the method by which the mind defends convictions already reached. Here's the whole thing. Reason is not the method by which the mind reaches conclusions, but the method by which the mind defends convictions already reached. Stephen, what do you suppose he means by that?
Well, I guess he means we tend to think of
reason as kind of a faculty of our mind by which we make conclusions about something, like your example where it's like, should I eat tinfoil for lunch? And then we use a reason to come to the conclusion by which we state that we should not eat tinfoil. He would say that we already have the conviction that we shouldn't eat it in our mind, but then we just kind of go through this stepwise process by which we justify it.
Exactly. The conviction was already there. This is called by Hume instrumentalism. Instrumentalism. So tie that word with this idea. How does reason function? It functions as an instrument by which your prior convictions are defended, not the method by which you reach your convictions. Avery.
How would he address the idea of you have a conviction, you think of reason to defend it, and then you think of reason to oppose it and change your conviction?
Yeah. He grants that that happens, but he says that's rare, you know. And he says in the ordinary course of events, what happens, he grants that does happen. And it's a good question. It's a counterexample that puts him it gives him a problem. His response in general is this: it's not often that happens. He says, you march a Christian into a room and an atheist into a room. All right? The Christian believes in God and uses reason to defend the Christian's belief in God. The atheist doesn't believe in God and uses the same reason to defend the principle that God doesn't exist. And the two of them are using reason as a weapon to defend themselves rather than as a method of possibly changing their views. And that in the ordinary course of events, that takes place, you know. You think about the convictions that you hold deeply, and what you'll find is that when those convictions are challenged, your first impulse is to use reason to rise to their defense. If you're politically conservative, you don't really sit down and entertain the liberal perspective on things. You don't sit down and say, well, now let's see if these liberals have a perspective. You don't do that. Nobody does. You're a conservative, and when you see an argument made by a liberal, your first thought is just how wrong that is. And reason is pulled out of your arsenal of weapons to attack that and defend yourself, rather than as kind of a detached, sort of cool, level-headed, you know, kind of walk through the thought process. And a liberal's the same way. Granted, occasionally, Avery, you have a conservative that becomes a liberal. Granted, you sometimes have a liberal that becomes a conservative, but generally not. 99% of the time, people stay in whatever that conviction is that they have, and it's gone back to a point in their life where it wasn't reason that got them there at all. It's almost like it was hardwired in. You know, that's what he's pointing at. I think personally he overstates the point, but I do think, you know, there's something to it. There is a sense in which people, their first impulse is to use reason to defend themselves rather than to sit down and sort of in a detached way reconsider their own position. It doesn't often happen that way. Yeah.
So how would he explain how people have differences in conviction? Because it kind of seemed like we would all have the same conviction if it's just because we can't use reason in order to arrive at different.
His answer to that is, I use the term hardwired. He wouldn't use that term, but it's something like that. It just happens to be the way you are. And it's, I think he would say it's virtually random. You know? It is once again an assault by Hume on any notion of objective truth. Truth is only what you deem it to be, and you will fight like mad to defend your particular view of the truth. And here's Krista, who's got a very different view of the truth, and she'll fight like mad to defend her view. And generally, we're not going to change our opinions. And whatever we think is the truth is really the truth for us. This is kind of the birth of that whole sort of subjectivistic view of truth. And reason rarely is a vehicle by which I change my views. I will say this, as, speaking as someone who's involved in teaching and have been, for many, many years, I've been astonished when I'm in teaching environments. It doesn't happen so much here, although it can, but it certainly happens when I'm in the college level, of making what I believe is an absolutely compelling case for something or other. I mean, overwhelming to me, convincing beyond any reasonable, alternative hypothesis, and have somebody still look at me with a straight face and say, well, I'm not persuaded by that. Well, what do you mean you're not persuaded by that? I have just given you an avalanche of reasons why you should be changing your view on this subject. But you know what? In the average situation, it doesn't happen. I don't generally change my views, they don't change their views, and we're both engaged in a colossal exercise in instrumentalism, in which reason is just the device by which I'm defending myself and attacking, rather than by which I'm examining my own, perspective on my own views and possibly reconsidering it. It's pretty rare to find someone who would do that. So again, while I don't follow him on this, I have to grant the point, reluctantly, that he is describing something that you do see a lot. Please.
So, if we don't use reason to arrive at conclusions by ourselves, what is the method by which we take impressions? Because it seems like with impressions, we're looking at something and using our reason.
Well, maybe we're looking at nothing. First of all, you think you're looking at something, but we don't know if there's a something there. The only thing you know is that you're having these impressions. And you are imposing on those impressions certain ideas. We don't know where those ideas came from. They may just be the chance, random, sort of arrangement of your DNA. You throw the dice. In your case, or in any of our cases, maybe 10 million dice are thrown, and they all come up in some sort of random order, and kabingo, out comes Sid. You throw the dice again, out comes Avery. You throw the dice again, out comes, whatever. And it's just random. Just random. So, Sidney happens to have certain views on certain things that differ from Avery Chase, and neither of them is willing to get together in a sort of neutral think tank and reconsider their views. They simply use what we call reason to defend what was there on a perfectly random basis that resulted from the roll of the dice. Yeah.
So Hume kind of assumes that idea of equipollence, right? Yes. As a practical matter, yes. And he's saying that's the reason why there is equipollence. Is because everybody is just going to defend their own view. And even if you can win the chess game with them, they still walk away unpersuaded. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. He says we're all that way to some degree. That, I think, is an interesting thing to think about. Again, I'm not trying to talk you into becoming Humean, but there is something to it. I've thought about conversations I've had with people in an evangelistic or an apologetical kind of situation where I'm trying to defend. When I first started practicing law, I had a friend who was an atheist and quite outspoken, very liberal, taught over at North Idaho College, just a rabid liberal. I mean, just off the scale. He thought, well, I won't even go into that, but anyway, he was kind of a socialist, communist, very bright, very warm-hearted, very nice guy, just a wonderful guy, But we were so far apart politically, theologically, we couldn't even see each other from where we were, so far apart. We had many conversations. And my experience was, he would always raise all the standard criticisms of the Christian faith. Well, what about the Crusades? And what about evil? And this and that, all this stuff. Like, whoa, I never thought of that before, And I would raise similar questions. And my experience was, even though we had very amicable conversations, that if I ever got past that iron veneer of his, the effect on him was just that he'd get mad. He'd just get mad. Very
sort of politely mad, but it wasn't like he was ever prepared to sit down and say, well, you really got a point there. You know, he never did that. But I'm going to tell you honestly, I really never did that with him either. I never really, in my heart, felt like he'd made a good point in terms of criticizing the idea that there's a God in heaven. I just never got there in my head. You know, because I'm convinced that there's God. And he's convinced that there isn't. And all we did was use reason to beat on each other. And so when you're thinking about apologetics, while we need to do apologetics, you always have to kind of have that in mind. There is that little bit of psychology that makes the whole enterprise a little more complicated. It's not like we're just working out in a detached way, these rational ideas. All right, so that's reason. That leads us to his next talking point, which is morality. He says, your morality does not arise from your reason. Your moral code is already there. It's a level of your conviction. By which you are deeply motivated, but it's not there as a result of reason. You defend it by reason. It's the very same principle applied to your morality as to any other conviction. The bottom line here, your morality is purely arbitrary. Your morality is purely arbitrary. It's basically an instinct. That's all. What you call virtue is just an instinct. You didn't control it. You didn't invent it. It's not some great purpose by which you're guiding your life. It's just the same kind of instinct you'd find in any animal. It's just in your case, it seems to come in a class of things that we call morality. I shouldn't walk over and punch Spencer in the nose. Let's see. Maybe I'd like to, maybe I feel like there's sometimes good reason to, but I have a moral code. But that moral code is not there because I thought it through one day or because there's some kind of rational process. It's just there. And so it makes morality itself a very different kind of thing. Go ahead.
Why would he say we have laws then? Because wouldn't those be imposing on our moral codes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because one of the things about my sense of morality is even though he says it's really just the arbitrary makeup of my own personality, I have this big feeling that you should live by my moral code. You know, I have this idea, if something is in the class of things I call moral, that it not only should apply to me, but it should apply to you too, and you, and you, and you. You know, you should all be living by my moral code. And to the degree I can get other people to sort of share, or find people who do share my general moral outlook, and to the degree I can sort of pull together some kind of political power, I can do that. I can start forcing people to live by my moral code. But in the bottom of the analysis, it's not that that moral code is any better than any others. It just happens to be, you know, the instincts that I was born with. So again, you can see, I hope you can see how it changes the whole understanding of what is morality. And we are living in Hume's world. I mean, Hume has really created, in many ways, the modern world. There is a very, you know, how many times have you heard that, well, you know, it's like called multiculturalism. Well, you know, that culture has that particular practice, that culture has a different practice, and who's to say who's right? I mean, just because we happen to view things one way and that culture happens to view things another way, let's realize that it's just kind of the way it works out, and that there's no final virtue up there that we should be imposing on everybody. Well, that's a very Humean outlook, you know. He's kind of delivered on a silver platter a lot of the values that you find in your modern age. Was that you, Ben? There was a hand over there. Was that Josiah? Go ahead.
Yesterday you said that Hume had a reason why murder is wrong, but from what you just said, it wouldn't make sense for him to say that.
I'm trying to think what the context was in which I did say that. Do you recall? Can you reconstruct that?
I can remember.
I think you were Ben begun. It was the causation. It's not.
Right. Ben's example of.
Yeah, that's what Ben was talking about yesterday.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact context, but.
Hume, personally, I think my point was Hume would say it's wrong. I mean, Ben was talking about putting a gun to Hume's head.
Yeah.
And Hume wouldn't like that very much, you know.
Yeah.
But Hume would also grant, in the greater scheme of things, that's just his private opinion. He would prefer not to get shot and, you know, run out the door. But he would also grant, in the grander scheme, maybe for Ben that is the right thing to do. And each of them is going to instrumentally use reason or power, anything else at their disposal to defend their own perspective. Is that responsive? I'm not. It's a good question, but I think that's kind of the way he deals. Yeah, it is. Yeah. He says it's a pure accident that a lot of us share the same moral outlook, you know. But he says, hey, that could be, you know, it's just the fact that we were born into a place where that morality was already more or less at work, and we just inherited it from our parents, from our culture, and so on. But it isn't that we work that out in some sort of precise moral science, and that's how we hold these views. All right. I've got a couple of more bullets here. I'll try to start this one. Probably won't get through it. It is one of the more important points in Hume. It's his treatment of free will and determinism. So Hume says we have this sort of instinctive idea that there are two principles that are at odds with each other. One is free will, one is determinism. So if I asked you, Nicole, what is determinism? Would you have an idea what that's describing? What is determinism or a deterministic outlook? What does that mean? Any idea?
That I can determine what I want to do?
In a sense, yes, but that doesn't quite get at it. Determinism has a little bit of a different thought to it, but that's part of what it would mean. Ben, what does it mean?
Is it that everything we do is determined and planned?
Exactly. Determinism typically, in most people's minds, is the opposite of free will. We have this sort of kind of casual idea in our heads that we do the things we want, we do the things we do because we choose to. You've all chosen to come to class. The fact of the matter, any one of you could have made a decision before you walked in the door this morning not to go to class. You could have. You could have decided to go down to the teacher's lounge, open this freezer, and see if there's any goodies in there for teachers. And look at there. There's those ice cream sandwiches that somebody nice brought for the teachers. And you could say, oh, look, I think I'll eat one of those. You could have done that. Do you realize that? Nothing is for now. You might have gotten caught. You might have been, has gotten in trouble, wound up in the print. But nothing prevents you, in fact, from doing a whole lot of stuff right now. You could all stand up in unison right now and throw your pens and pencils at me. I'm not suggesting you do. I hope you don't, but you could do that. Shouldn't give you any ideas. But you realize we have this notion in our heads, don't we? That the things we do because we've chosen to. And the fact that we're choosing to do these things implies some sense, some feeling in us that we're free. We have some idea that we are free to do the things we choose to do. All right, so that's the notion. Determinism would generally stand for the idea that you have no freedom. That you are, in fact, determined by forces that you cannot control, that everything you do, everything you say, all these supposed decisions you make are being driven almost like a machine, like a computer program. Computers don't have free will, as far as we know. Sometimes, in the case of my computer, I wonder. I think it may be demon-possessed, though, so that's going to account for that. And we see those two as incompatible. You all following me? You got that, right? So and I'm going to have to stop right there, unfortunately. And we'll pick up on that very point tomorrow and try to finish up Hume and these last couple of little items. Go ahead.
Well, what do you say you're driven by?
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Hume is going to wind up with a conclusion you may not expect, but I'll have to save that, so just hang on to that. Arrivederci.